Thank you everyone so much for joining me this afternoon. My name is Upasna, and I'm gonna wait for my presentation to come up. Oh, let's back up. All right. I remember the first time I spoke on stage. Okay. Okay, my name is Upasna. I'm a product manager at CNN. I also live and work remotely here in Austin, Texas. It's my adopted home for the last 8 years. So for those of you visiting for the first time, welcome. If you need taco recommendations, I know a lot more about that than actual product management, so hit me up. I mentioned I work at CNN. I was working remotely pre-pandemic, so that's why today we're going to talk about remote product management strategies pre, during, and post-pandemic. I work on the digital news and platform team, which means I'm a platform product manager, and my customers, my users, are our journalists. So I work on building our content management system, and that's the platform that powers the news that's delivered to the world. And in addition to that, an exciting new streaming service that we're building called CNN Plus. So I'm the core programming platform product manager or something like that. Prior to that, I worked in data science and SEO for a decade and transitioned into product about 3 years ago. I'm also a public speaking coach at Shine Bootcamp, which you can't really tell right now because I'm so nervous to be on stage after 2 years of virtual talking. And I also am a mindfulness and meditation teacher on the side. So if you're interested in any of that, I talk about the intersection of those three things a lot. Okay, so today, remote product management. We're going to talk about the 3 biggest challenges that remote product and hybrid product managers have faced over the past 2 years, and some tactical solutions and frameworks that you can start incorporating into your day-to-day. And then we'll talk about this elusive work-life balance as a remote product manager, and hopefully leave you with some really tactical frameworks and applications that you can walk away with and work to incorporate not only in your day-to-day, but also help to empower your teammates with too. So as we all know, whether you're a hybrid or fully remote product manager, or you've gone back to the office, you're still probably working with people in all 3 buckets. This isn't really the future of work anymore, it's our present day reality. Working at CNN, all of my colleagues are all over the globe, mostly in the United States, but also time zones are, a very new kind of concept to product management remote working. My team is actually the first one in the history of a legacy organization, which used to be Turner, which is now Warner Media, to become a fully remote product team, which is exciting, but also presents a lot of challenges. So we'll dive into in a little more detail here. I mentioned at the bottom of this slide that virtual interpersonal communication and interactions are key. That's kind of the consistent theme throughout this entire session. And every single one of the challenges presented can really be tied back to that kind of element. So the 3 biggest challenges that have kind of formed into these 3 buckets fall under cross-functional collaboration, unclear goals and strategies, and of course, burnout, meeting fatigue. So in true product management fashion, let's dive into each one of these problems in a little more detail before we get into talking about takeaways and solutions. Always want to not just understand what the problem is, but why is the problem a problem in the first place? So when we think about cross-functional collaboration, whether you're at a startup or a massive organization, or you're a solopreneur, you have different buckets of people that you work with. As a platform product manager working in a mid to large size organization, you're going to have your teammates, you're going to have your customers, and you're going to have your stakeholders. As a product manager, this is going to be pretty consistent no matter where you are. But with virtual communication and collaboration, it does require a really new and different way of communicating and building and fostering relationships. So everybody's different. Even product managers are very different. we have the far end of the spectrum of extroverts and the far end of the spectrum of introverts. I'm kind of towards the introverted side. And sometimes, when I actually first started working remotely pre-pandemic, there would be a whole day that goes by where I haven't talked to a single person, whether it's on Slack or a meeting. And you realize over time that, yes, it's great to get that heads down work time in, but without fostering that intentional collaboration, can actually result in some pretty big challenges around cross-functionality. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. And of course, global or national time zones, it's always difficult to get people together physically and virtually in a room. And one thing that really sucks about virtual communication versus physical is you don't have body language to go off of, right? Like, even right now, I mean, I'm loving being back on stage because I can like see people nodding their head or rolling their eyes or whatever it is, but like over a screen, you're kind of just looking at a screen. And even things like pausing, right, is totally misinterpreted virtually. If you're trying to explain something and you're having, you know, a thought process in your mind and explaining and you pause, people assume you're done talking. Whereas if you're in person virtually speaking, it's very obvious and common, like, hey, I'm just thinking about something for a second, or I'm just taking a breath. So there's a lot of misinterpretation that can occur virtually, and especially for product managers, because our entire work is built around communication. This, again, can pose a lot of unintentional or misguided problems. One thing that we can no longer take for granted, whether you're hybrid, completely remote, or fully back in the office, is you can't take other people's time and communication for granted anymore. Remember, no matter what setting you're in, that everyone isn't in the room at all times. Not all your stakeholders are, not all your customers are, and not all your teammates are. And if you get that to happen, awesome, and mad props to you, but it's very rare, as we all know. So for better or for worse, a lot of us have just acclimated to that reality, whatever it may be. And it's easy to forget that not everyone is in the same situation as we are in that moment, in that meeting, in that Slack channel, in that email thread. And so if you're in the office yourself, you may forget about the people who are remote. And on the flip of that, if you're the one working from home, you might discount the in-person interactions that are occurring without you in the room. So this tends to lead into the second biggest grievance and frustration that product managers have, and probably everyone who's worked remotely in tech has had at some point. How many times have you either heard or said these phrases? That meeting could have been an email. What was the point of that meeting? That was a waste of time. What's the status of X? Do you have an update on this? What about now? Ooh, do you have an update now? Why are we even doing this right now? Been there, done that so many times. And I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding, so it probably means you've been the one saying it, or someone pretty close to you has inspired you to say that. And then what does that lead to? Meeting fatigue and burnout. Boundaries are essential for product managers to be successful in a remote working environment, full stop, period. It is the simplest and hardest thing to execute, but you'll learn over time, once you start establishing them with your stakeholders and your teammates especially, people take you a lot more seriously. And we'll talk about what that means for you in your day-to-day in a little more detail. So we talked about those 3 key problems. Let's talk about some strategies and frameworks and solutions of how can we create a sustainable and successful remote hybrid work structure for the future and for now. 3 key things that I try to incorporate every single day. 1 is smart repetition. This also is sometimes known as over-communication, but we'll talk about specifically what smart repetition means. 2nd is an OKR-driven roadmap. And 3rd is my favorite, ruthless, fierce prioritization. Okay, so let's talk about smart repetition. Again, sometimes also known as over communication. So great product managers and effective ones who are able to get shit done and have people listen to them are able to handle all different types of people and their styles of communication with clarity and empathy. Two massive buzzwords that have emerged over the course of the pandemic. What does that actually mean? This means that you go into every single communication or conversation you have, whether it's in person, in an email, in a Slack message, or an in-person meeting, with the baseline understanding that life is chaotic and everyone forgets shit. I cannot even imagine being in a position where I finally accepted that I can't remember things by memory all day long. I learned that the hard way when I first started working from home. And that's not just, I know it's not just me. And assume that is everybody that you're working with, especially your stakeholders and especially your teammates. Don't make assumptions. And when you're conversing, we need to converse in the language of the listener. The key takeaway here is come into every conversation with the mindset of a teacher and keeping that smart repetition in mind. So what does conversing in the language of the listener mean? When you're talking to a teammate versus your customer versus your stakeholder. I actually have a whole separate presentation just on this topic that I scrunched down to this one slide. But I think this is important to understand that the way you talk and you need to know your audience is one of the biggest and most effective ways to think about what you're writing when you communicate or what you're saying when you communicate. So when you're talking to your stakeholders, get to the point. And we'll talk about, in the next slide, what does that mean? What do you include in that communication when you say, when someone says, get to the point? Being succinct and focusing on aims and outcomes. One thing to avoid in general, which I will be attempting to smartly repeat throughout this whole session, is avoid laundry lists, avoid reacting to people's questions and feedback, listen to understand, not to respond, and especially when you're talking to a stakeholder, that time is so precious, especially in a large organization. Promise everyone that when I have the 2 minutes with Anderson Cooper, I do not talk and I just listen. And I want to hear the grievances, and I want to document that and translate it back to my team effectively to understand what we need to fix. With your more junior teammates, whether it's your design team, whether it's another product member, whether it's an engineering person, make sure you allow more time to process information and help them come along on the journey so that they're walking on the same path you are towards the same goal. Very different conversations. And then for your customers, I love that the last panel talked about this. Focus on asking high quality questions. Time is of the essence. So when we think about smart repetition and all of these 3 different buckets of important people that you need to interact with on a daily basis, to make your message actually stick so people don't forget, and they will forget over and over and over again, people need to hear it in multiple different modes, times, and ways, not necessarily the same way. So deliver them early, frequently, and consistently. Be a broken record. I find myself saying that every single day. I just said this 2 minutes ago. But guess what? There was someone missing in that room or in that mode of communication. So be that broken record, whether you're having a one-on-one or a group meeting or a Slack message. We'll go over a framework that you can use every single time so you don't have to start from scratch and create new messages from scratch. And then using that consistent framework for all of your messaging going forward. Here it is. If there's one thing you take away from today, I hope it's this. This actually also came from my presentation deck I gave last year on stakeholder communication, but it's not just stakeholder communication. I use this framework everywhere. I even use it to build my presentation decks. So first and foremost, and we'll talk in the lens of a stakeholder, of stakeholder communication, since that's like the most highly frustrating and stressful situation usually. So in that 3 minutes that you might have with them, and you have to deliver something, and something impactful. State the problem and why the problem is a problem. That circle wasn't big enough to add that in there, but the why the problem is a problem is of utmost importance, more than what's the problem. They probably already know what the problem is. What's the why behind it? This is your observation. And this should be consistent with things you've outlined in things like your vision, your mission, and your OKRs. This shouldn't be breaking news to them. Oh my God, no pun intended at all. That's so lame. Second, insights. Think of this as context. Use this opportunity to validate what you're saying the problem is, why it's a problem, what the observation is. This can be context that comes from technical limitations that you've done during product discovery. It could be feedback that you've gotten from user research interviews. Anything that can provide validation and substance to stating the problem that you just told the stakeholder about. And then the third most commonly missed part is key takeaways. After you say all this stuff to your stakeholder or your teammate, then what? What do you want them to do next? What do you need to do next? This is the time to really get hyper-specific and define your tactical next steps. If you need assistance from stakeholders or leadership, this is the time and space to ask for it, because now you've set up the stage that you've talked about. Why is a problem a problem? How have you validated it? And here's what I need to solve this problem. Now, going back to asking smart questions. This list I pulled, I'm sure many people in this room are familiar with the icon Shreyas Doshi on Twitter. If you're not, you should absolutely follow him. He is like the only product management education I've ever had. Ask yourself these questions before you go into a meeting, before you compose an email or even honestly, I use this for drafting up release notes. So what are you really trying to say? When we're writing up release notes, before we had product really involved in the process at CNN, engineers used to write them. And it had no context whatsoever around how it's going to affect our editorial workflow. What does this mean for the journalist who's writing the article in the content management system? What changed for them? What's the impact? So what are you really trying to say? Why should people care? If they don't care or if they shouldn't care, you should absolutely omit it. What is the most important point? Focus on that thing. The most important point usually is, why is the problem a problem? And then, what is the easiest way to understand the most important point? This next one is also the most commonly missed. How do you want the listener to feel? As product managers, we're usually trying to get something out of somebody. So you need to kind of turn up the charm when it comes to how do you want the listener to feel. And this is why it's so important to know your audience, right? If you're talking to a stakeholder that doesn't want the details and just needs to know, what do you need from me to make X happen? Get to the point. You don't need to worry about how they feel. But if it's a user or one of your teammates, you definitely want to take into consideration how you want them to feel so you can get them to do what you need to do. And again, this kind of ties back to number 3, key takeaways and next steps from the 3-part framework is, what should the listener do next? Tactical, objective stuff. All in all, whether you're talking to a stakeholder, your users, or any of your teammates, in written communication especially, time is of the essence and there's a lot of power in brevity. Make your updates memorable, repeat them, and make them extremely vivid and clear. You should be editing them multiple times before you send them out. Think about the questions that we just went over, and are you checking off all of the boxes there before you hit send off to a Slack channel of 100 people? Are they gonna read it? Even things like formatting, right? I have done some really silly experiments of on Slack of if people reply with like the emoji, and if I'm writing a paragraph of text, I get very, very minimal, or like even chunks of paragraphs, I get very minimal reaction. Whereas if I put bullet points of like, here are the updates, here's the status, like just simple formatting helps tremendously because people can quickly scan if they're in a meeting or if they're doing something else. And again, remember that they're gonna forget, so repeat, reuse, and recycle that information in different ways. Memorable, repeat it, and make it really clear. Second strategy is an OKR-driven roadmap. I'm gonna like really gloss over this one because roadmaps are just like the nightmare of all product management in remote in remote work, but they can serve as a beacon for you and your team and especially your stakeholders. Use this document to illustrate, like literally illustrate a visual path from where you are now to realizing the vision you have spelled out in your product strategy, whether you created it or not. Keep it simple, keep it high level, reflect on objectives only. That's it. I think here the key is don't get caught up in feature delivery. Focus on objectives and outcomes as opposed to output. It's not intended to be a spec, right? And definitely not a laundry list of features. Here's one thing that I've started to do in the past 6 months. I have a working document of the roadmap that I constantly update and have a little more context and details in, and then have a shareable version for my users and stakeholders and leadership. And this is kind of pinned to different channels. It's stored in a couple of different wikis. Engineers to leadership have access to it and reference it in those updates you give consistently and frequently. Going back to my favorite product person, Shreyas, he shared this on Twitter, I think it was a couple months ago, and I absolutely loved it because it's just, again, brevity is everything here. When you think about what you're doing and why you're doing it, all you need to illustrate in a roadmap is when. Stakeholders, especially, and your users, if you're a platform product manager, couldn't give two shits about how you do something. They want to know when they're going to get the thing that's going to enable them to do their job well. So when you think about visualizing a roadmap, it doesn't even mean attach specific dates to it, right? When can they expect it? Dates on a roadmap take away from more of the objectives that you should be focusing on, and you can put that on there for yourself. I keep the really specific dates on my work in progress doc. All right, number 3, ruthless, fierce, it's understated prioritization. And we know as product managers, there's a ton of different frameworks out there. RICE is my personal favorite that I started with when I first became a product manager, but then I also realized over time that frameworking prioritization is kind of bullshit too, because it's so subjective and it's based off of your own instinct, honestly, and your best judgment. But the thing is, as product managers, when you do all of the above, you kind of get a better and stronger instinct over time to make better decisions and stronger estimates. No matter what, and I repeat this all the time to my own team, is if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority, no matter what. So however you need to prioritize, whatever framework you enjoy using to make sure that everything isn't top priority, great. By all means, you should continue to use that. Don't get distracted by those lists of outputs and features. It just glorifies the work in outputs. Prioritize based off of what's going to deliver the greatest outcome and solve your most important problems. And you have to make no your favorite word. And I have learned over time, especially remotely working, there are a lot of ways that you can negotiate and also elicit a no. And so not everyone's going to like you, but the right people will respect you, I promise. Stay firm on your goals, but flexible on the process that you take to get there. Because as a product manager or even like a senior product manager, you're usually never managing people, and you're managing a timeline or a product or a set of stuff to do, but you're still in charge and responsible for moving everyone in the same direction to achieve a single goal. And so as long as you are adaptable along the way and reiterate with that smart repetition where we're going, again, over written communication, over email, in meetings. You should just start every single stand-up you have with it. This is our goal today. And as hyper-specific as you can get, and then edit it again to make it even more specific. Here are another set of smart questions to ask yourself when you think about prioritization, no matter what framework that you use. 1, what do you need in the next X months to make the most meaningful progress towards your strategy? 2nd, what are the main risks you need to eliminate? 3rd, how important is growth right now versus protecting what you have versus laying a foundation for future growth? Very dependent on the type of product you're building and the company you're a part of. Sometimes all 3 can coexist. Last but not least, what is largely in your control, your team's control, and when and how do you need to rely on other teams or leadership or stakeholders to get what you need? And because of that reliance, what kind of dependencies and risks are there? So when we think about prioritization, it can be objective, but in order to achieve that objectivity, it's actually really subjective. And it's basically an art and a science, and it's combining everything we think we know about this thing from the past, and that's where assumptions kind of get us in trouble, with the fixed resources we have right now to predict an order or a sequence in which to do things to improve our collective future. I think my boss said that one time, and I wrote it down, and I just ripped it off him and put it on here. But it makes sense. What are the things that you can use to validate this order of stuff to do? One of the best ways to think about that validation, again, this is like a whole nother conversation, but think about validation with your teammates from design, from engineering, from UX especially, and validate in those buckets. And then the 4th one is your business viability. So when you think about those 4 buckets, design and UX sometimes together, when you think about prioritizing, make sure you're engaging your teammates to bring that prioritization to life in the most highest level of accuracy as you possibly can, because sometimes it's a crapshoot. Okay, got some formulas, hopefully one that helps. Let's talk about this work-life balance, the elusive, mysterious, unattainable work-life balance as a product manager. Does it exist? Just kidding, kind of. It does, and you can create some healthy boundaries and habits to help. And there's a lot of caveats to this, get it. But here are 4 that I use every single day that don't require any tools or apps or anything external other than you and a piece of paper and a pen. I shared this on Twitter randomly like a month ago, and it was one of those things I was just writing out as a thread when I first started writing threads, and it just blew up, and it's like one of those things I just assumed everybody does, so I'm sharing it because it helps some other people, so maybe it'll help you all too. So one thing I do, no matter what, is I do not jump into my Mondays with meetings and block off the first half of my calendar for no meetings. Also, smart repetition is very, very important here. My boss knows, my team knows, I have it up on my Slack, I reiterate it to them every couple of weeks, and honestly, nobody cares. Nobody really wants to be in a meeting with you on Monday morning, so take the time. Take that couple of hours even. I highly encourage starting with 1 day a week to completely disconnect for 1 to 4 hours, depending on what you can do and what is available in your schedule. On Fridays, no meetings. This changes based on how close to a product launch we are, of course. That hasn't been happening for me for the past couple of weeks, and it probably won't till the spring, but I've preserved that Monday time fiercely. And you'll kind of see over time that once you start really holding down your own promises to yourself and your boundaries, other people, by default, will respect them. If you continue to put those blocks on your calendar but don't actually observe them, and people are like, well, she always just accepts meetings even though there's a block on her calendar, they're gonna keep doing it. So once you stop and preserve that time, whether it's for having lunch or just getting some heads down work in or going on a walk, just don't respond. Unless like you work in healthcare or maybe for the government, It's not that serious. One thing I also do at the end of each workday is plan for the next one. The rule of 3 is my favorite. Create a quick checklist, no more than 3 items, to tackle the next morning. This is also my ritual that the workday is over. Literally jot it down on a sticky note. What are 3 things that I have to get done tomorrow? They might have been things I didn't get done today. They might be things I need to get done next week or over the course of the week, but 3 things I want to tackle tomorrow. Then, in order to force prioritization for myself, I try to fit and schedule those next day's tasks and priorities into my calendar in time blocks. Sometimes it's as easy as, it's like one of those daunting tasks, like release notes. I have a love-hate relationship with them, and I know that now after doing them for so long, it takes me like 30 minutes to do them, and I just need to do it. So I block out the time to do it, and I also, when you let other people know that's what you're doing, and you're taking on that daunting task, they're like, oh yeah, just leave her alone. She's doing that thing nobody wants to do. And so fit that into your actual calendar alongside your meetings and other commitments. And then the last thing I do on Fridays is, this is a great kind of alleviator of the Sunday scaries, is I plan my next week every Friday evening by identifying my top 3 priorities for the upcoming week and then go into the weekend with a clear mind. Just focusing on the 3 helps so much. It forces you to prioritize, and also you'll find that once you start to do that yourself and you start communicating with your team and your stakeholders, you'll have really, really clear vision and insights into what are the important things you need to be doing. Thank you guys so much for your time today. I hope that was